Hello and welcome to episode 5 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by MetsmerizedOnline.com. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, along with executive editor at MMO, Mike Mayer, and we're joined this week by Mets Director of Amateur Scouting, Marc Tramuta. Marc, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Excited to do this and happy to meet you guys.
Absolutely. Same here. Mike, how we doing? You got all the screens up for tonight, and you got a lot of games between the Miners and the Mets going on.
Yep, got all the screens up. In fact, I'm following Calvin Ziegler right now, the Mets second rounder from last year.
Love it. Well, like we said, Marc Tramuta is joining us today. He's director of amateur scouting for the Mets. He's got a long background. Started from his playing days when he was drafted by the Dodgers in the 1991 draft. Played in the major or professional ball for a bit, and now has been working for the Mets, I believe, since 2017. So, Marc, I know you got some things going on here with the draft coming up, right around the corner. So we just kind of wanted to, have you explain a little to the fans kind of what your role is, kind of the day to day, and what you do in the role there.
So right now we're almost towards the end of the first leg of this scouting season. But as far as my role here, obviously oversee about 16 area scouts. I think we have about 8 cross-checkers, a couple senior advisors, and I do a lot of the day-to-day stuff. Obviously, Tommy Tanis oversees both international and amateur scouting. And then we have a couple guys in the office that I oversee as well, Tom Fleischman, one of them. And so that's, it's a relatively normal-sized staff. We've been able to add a couple guys over the last few years, which has been great. We've gotten more in-depth scouting the country, which is really good to have. Obviously, with a shorter draft, you're not drafting and signing as many players anymore, but it's good to get additional looks. So really happy with where we are as a staff and what we've been able to, with ownership has allowed us with the resources to add over the last couple of years.
So how has that kind of changed your focus going from the 40 and then went all the way down to 5 and now back up to 20? How has that kind of changed what you guys do, or has it changed really?
I don't think it's changed too much. It's just obviously the volume of players that you would turn in. I think there's obviously, when you look at rounds 21 to 40, I was one of those players, 45th round actually, but you're looking at more fillers in the rosters, and without the 2 minor league teams anymore, you're not doing that as much. I don't think it's changed any kind of scouting philosophy or anything. You're just not, maybe you're taking a chance or two on some late high school players, maybe some senior signs. And, there are big leaguers that have come from rounds 21 to 40 and beyond, but it really hasn't changed too much in how we approach the draft.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, just from the Mets standpoint, Seth Lugo was a 34th round pick. So that's a type of guy that wouldn't even get drafted or would have to end up signed as a free agent.
Right. I think the one thing it limits is obviously you have the area scouts, and they're usually the only, maybe sometimes the only scout that would see that particular player. If it's a Power 5 team where you're rolling through the SEC and ACC, obviously I would see them, or the cross checkers. But a lot of guys, you bring up Seth at a smaller school. Yeah, that's you wish you still had that for the area scouts to pull one out. They're gut feel guys. But that's just the way it is now. But again, it doesn't really change any kind of strategic approach or anything.
Interesting. And I was wondering, we kind of put out a little poll before this and had some folks, ask some questions that they may be interested in. One that kept coming up was, I was wondering, if you could tell us like what benefit to have someone like Ben Zosmer has been in the organization now that the R&D department's kind of gotten revamped and really become, a lot larger than it was. And I was just wondering, how you use that to kind of help your scouts, look through some of the more moderate data available, especially for arms that you like, so to speak.
Yeah, first of all, Ben is tremendous. Obviously, he came over from the Dodgers. He's really, him and Des McGowan and a bunch of other analysts that put together, everybody's calling it a model now. That's what teams use across the landscape of baseball. But they're really, first off, that's their expertise. And the relationship that we have with scouting and the analytics people is very good here. It's gone in different waves and it's evolved. I mean, obviously, Paul DePodesta was here. So he had a great background in analytics with Moneyball and so on. But Des and Ben, when you introduce new people to scouts, especially from that department of analytics, sometimes I work with other teams maybe where there's been friction and some, how scouting and analytics go. But this department with Ben and Des leading it is just a great relationship that we have. And Tommy and I welcome that. We want the data. Anything that you're going to make a big investment in, You want all the information, and we use it as much as we can. I think last year Ben made a joke to me after the draft, and he said he thought I looked at the numbers too much, and he listened to the scouts too much. So we joked about that. And it's just a really good relationship. They're very, very bright people, and you'd be foolish not to use that data and dig and try to get an edge. I think that's one thing Tommy and I have done, and Ben as well. Where can we find the next edge, whether it be scouting, whether it be analytics? Try to stay ahead of the curve. I think that's what they're doing in the analytics department, is trying to find that next edge, whether it's for the draft, minor league and player development, or the major league roster.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously see it from last year, just from an analytics standpoint, that a lot of the pitchers that you drafted were either high spin rate guys, big extension guys, that type of thing. When Carson Seymour, Dominic Hamill, Mike Vassell, a lot of those guys, you could see it just in the raw numbers that you're looking at. I mean, obviously from an analytics standpoint, those guys stood out. And I think maybe from that standpoint, and obviously from a scouting point, you guys probably feel like you were able to steal a couple of those guys later than they might have been there.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so, at least. So when we're scouting, the scouts are trying to compare the amateur player, to the major league player. The analytics people are doing the same thing. They're comparing the data from the amateur to what plays in the big leagues. And when the two of those match, when the scouting lens matches with the analytics lens, I'm all over those players. Usually those players are going to be pretty good and get to the big leagues. And then there's going to be some of those outliers. Sometimes we may go with a scout where the numbers aren't as good. And sometimes I'm going to go with the numbers when the scout doesn't like him as much. And so there has to be a compromise every once in a while. But when the two merge and both the scout likes the player and the analysts like the player, we're going to be all over that player.
Now, with that in mind, can you kind of talk about some of the guys that you got last year? I mean, all you have to do is watch the St. Lucie Mets, and you see how good that draft has been between Ziegler, Hamill, Mike Vassell. Carson Seymour has given up one run all season. Keyshawn Askew had a great start to the season. I mean, all the arms you guys drafted last year, and some of the bats too, have really played well in their first pro season, or first full pro season.
Yeah, I think quite a few of those guys had metrics that we want to identify without detail. Certainly, in Vassell's case, he was a player that Tommy and I had scouted in high school and had first, second round grades on him throughout our whole staff, and then went to Virginia, and the performance wasn't exactly what I'm sure he had hoped. But player development did a really good job with him last year, maybe changing the shape to his fastball, and the velocity also spiked. So now he's 94, 97. Maybe he's using a different pitch sequence or arsenal than he used in college, where now he's using 2 breaking balls instead of 1. So those are a lot of things, and that's not a knock on anything University of Virginia at all. I think some players, when they get to pro ball, you find out more about them maybe, and it's more development than having to win right away when you're in college. But he was certainly a kid that had a lot of talent when he was 18 years old, and we were sitting there and we're looking at the board, and Tommy brings it up to me. He goes, "God, we've always liked Vassell. Our guys just saw him at the ACC tournament. John Hendricks, who was the pitching coach at Wake Forest and now is back with us as a scout and development, he really liked Vassell too." So we put all that together and we're like, let's just take the kid. And it's been, knock on wood, it's been great to this point. But yeah, we certainly are looking for some unique, not necessarily unique, but sometimes it is unique or outlier or some kind of metric that matches up with what plays at the big leagues. And, we're going to identify that. And it's kind of a race because everybody sees the same data. But maybe, again, we're trying to look at something different in a different way. And that's what Ben and Des are really good at, coupled with what our scouts are looking for.
So you brought up the draft day stuff. Kind of run us through, without going into stuff that you don't want to talk about, but kind of run us through what a typical, maybe a week going up to the draft, and what that draft day kind of looks like for you and Tanuous and kind of the rest of the front office.
Well, we'll get into draft meetings with the cross-checkers next month. We'll set up Zoom calls, most likely with all of the area scouts, and they'll go over their list throughout the whole year. We do that anyway on a weekly basis. We have weekly conference calls where our cross-checkers, myself, Tommy, are on those calls with the area scouts. So they have a voice every single week. If we can't get on, we video them, or we have cliff notes of the conference calls. But leading up to the draft, we'll do stuff in June, get a lot of that board set up before we get to July. Now with the draft being so much later, you have some lag time to do that. With it being 2 months after the conference tournament. So, it's a process, but we'll do some days in June, and then we'll go in probably a week or so before the draft, and then really start to line up the board in more of a strict manner than when it's more loose in June. So that's kind of what we do. Like right now, like I said, we're getting towards the end of the season. We'll get the conference tournaments, and then have some workouts with players, have the Major League Combine in mid-June, and then start to think about how we want to put up the board in the middle of June.
Interesting. And as far as I was curious just how, when you get, obviously, you have your first round grades or whatever like that, kind of the big names, whatever that you're looking for in the draft. But, as obviously the draft has gone down, like you said, it's 20 rounds now as opposed to what it used to be. But when you get into those later rounds, I'm curious, is that where you find more of the discrepancy of maybe the scouts something that the analysts don't, or vice versa? Like, is it when you get towards the back end of the draft, is that when kind of those, not clashes, so to speak, but differences maybe on opinion on certain players kind of happen? Or
I think it happens within just scouting rooms. So, again, doing this for 26 years and being with 3 different teams, I've had the good fortune of actually sitting in on 25 drafts. So there are times where you see the board go the way you want it, and the way you don't want it, it gets decimated. But I think even when you look at some of the publications and you start looking at how they rank players from 1 to 200, after midway through the first round or the first round after that, it can be really jumbled and really different. And that comes back to the opinions of each department, maybe a philosophy of each department, how they use their analytics. But yeah, there's always going to be some disagreement. There's disagreements in scouts. But when you don't have as many looks at players later in the draft, I would never call them that they're disagreements. I think there might be maybe differences of opinion, but then we just try to put both together, re-look at it, go back and maybe watch more video on that player. There's so much more access nowadays to video with what's called synergy that almost every Division I school has in their stadium, and we get that. So I'm able to watch all of those players as well. So it'll tie together a little bit better now than it did, say, 20 years ago.
Gotcha. And you talked about, kind of difference of philosophy, things like that. Obviously, you're here now with the new regime, with the old regime before that. So just kind of talking about philosophy, I was wondering if there's anything you could kind of pinpoint, between the two regimes now, obviously, with the Epler, Showalter, and Cohen regime kind of, and I was wondering if there's any, differences that you've seen within the organization, maybe philosophy or approach or anything, and just wanted to get your thoughts there.
I don't think so. Sandy was great in the draft. He let Tommy and I do our things. He would be the first one to say, "Hey, I'm not a scout, but if you're going to be prepared to take a first round pick, Sandy's going to have really good questions for you." The other guys that obviously we had here, yes, everybody was a little bit different, but Billy Epler comes from a scouting background. He knows what we're going through. He's let us do our jobs to this point. He's been great, very supportive. He's, again, giving us the resources. Tommy keeps in touch with him all the time on what we're thinking in terms of that. But he's been really supportive. I mean, he's been through a ton of drafts himself in the current role that he's in. He was a scout before, knows the amateur world. So, in terms of philosophy, I wouldn't want to necessarily get into too much of that. But the guys that are currently here between Sandy and Billy, they've been great. Both of them know the draft from different perspectives, which is good too.
Now, this year, you're lucky enough to have 2 first rounders, and you have first 5 picks in the first 90. So do you get excited about that? How is it? How do you approach that? How, especially the first 2 rounders, does that change anything that you might do when you just have first rounder in terms of the type of player you might go after?
I'm sure it's possible. I think the one thing, given this dynamic this year, is I have some experience with this. In Toronto, when I was a national cross-checker in 10, 11, and 12, we had 23 picks over that 3-year span in the top 3 rounds. So in terms of draft strategy, Tommy was there for one of those years in 2010, and he left to come here, obviously. But I know the do's and the don'ts maybe of how to go about preparing for that type of draft haul, so to speak, for lack of a better term. When we made mistakes in Toronto, when we were successful in Toronto, having all those picks. So I think you still take the boring answer, take the best player available, but having all those picks, obviously it's printed how much pool money we have. And so, so there's a lot of scenarios that you can play around with, but I think the best thing to do is to stick with what you're good at and stick to a discipline and be disciplined.
Now, speaking kind of primarily about this year, and we're talking about the 2 first-round picks, anyone who follows the draft knows that there's been a ton of injuries this year of players that are likely could still get drafted in the first round. But how does that kind of play with your board and kind of change the scouting aspect and everything like that?
I think we had some sense of where the majority of those players were going to fall, if they had a normal year production-wise, and their stuff was relatively the same. With them being injured, obviously that could change the dynamic. It may not. I mean, we took a player a couple of years ago, JT Ginn, who didn't throw that much in his draft year, but we had followed him in high school. Our area scout, Jet Butler, knew the kid since he was 15 years old. We had history with him, so we were very comfortable taking that player. Will we have that with every one of the players who are injured right now? Probably not. But again, we have so much access to video, we can go back and watch their whole 2021 season when they pitched, or 2020 season. So we'll build our history that way. But I think that also obviously will depend on a lot of other factors, health-wise, where they go on the board. I mean, every year there's been guys in the past. I mean, Gunnar Hoagland last year, the Blue Jays took that got injured during the year. Clark Schmidt, who the Yankees had taken a few years ago, was hurt in the middle of that spring season. So I think you just have to weigh everything and what we think of their stuff, the medicals and all that stuff, whether or not to take them or not.
Awesome. And I kind of again talking about this year's draft, having 5 picks in the first 90. Would you say that this is kind of a crucial draft as far as with the new direction of, let's say, kind of the Mets organization in the minors? Do you think this is kind of a pivotal draft to kind of, we hear want to replicate the Dodgers of the East Coast, that sort of thing, and a lot of their successes, they have such a deep and successful farm system. So I was just wondering, with that many picks this year, do you think that it's kind of looked at as pivotal as far as revamping the farm system, so to speak?
Yeah, I won't hide from that. Absolutely, it is. It's 5 picks in the first 90 picks. We may never have this again. So yeah, I mean, it's welcomed. We want to hammer it. Just build upon what we did last year. Replenish, restock, however you want to say the farm system. But yeah, this is a big draft. We know it. Our staff knows it. When you have this many picks, you got to hammer it and do the best job that you can.
So let's switch molds a little bit and let's talk about John Maine. Now, you signed John Maine, and Maine ended up with the Mets, obviously, and had some good times with the Mets. So kind of walk us through your whole John Maine experience.
So it's a good story. I mean, I saw him in his second start, and I think I put him in the second round. And that his second start, which always in the scouting industry, we joke about staying away from second starts. They're always disastrous, or they seem to be. And my scouting director at the time and the national cross-checker for the Orioles went to see John's second start. He was horrible. And so I kept going back. I actually lived in Baltimore at the time, but went back and saw him again and again. And then our regional cross-checker, Dean DeSillis, who now is a national guy with the Blue Jays, I got him in to see him, and John was really good. So he's like, just stay on him. Don't, and again, I'm in this spot now. I don't always see the players' best performances. So you listen. I've never gone 100 for 100 on my draft list. So you listen to the area scouts. Well, we're sitting there in the draft, and I was an area scout at the time, and I lived in Baltimore, so I went to the draft. And we're sitting there on the board, and there's about 200 names lined up, and there's John Maine's magnet. He's like the only one left on any of the columns. And Dean, again, the cross-check, looked over and said, Tony DeMacio was a scout director at the time. He's like, Trams loved this guy all year. I saw him good. And Tony's like, can you sign him here in the 6th round? I said, yes. So he handed me the folder. We took him. And the rest is history. He had a really good career. Wish he wouldn't have had the injuries at the end. But he had some good years for the Mets. Pitched in a couple playoff games. So it was a good career, but it was, that's maybe a lesson, and where the scouting director listened. He didn't see that player good, but he listened to the area scout. He listened to the regional cross checker, and we got a big leaguer out of him.
Yeah, no, and he pitched in the playoff game 6 of the NLCS in 06. He was nails, got them to a game 7. Not like we remember that every day here or anything, but that's really cool. You keep talking about like you talk about national or cross checkers, that sort of thing. Can you maybe break down like a typical what the hierarchy pyramid is within like the scouting and development? I'm sure there's a lot of folks, amateur scouts, the director of scouting, those kind of, names. But I was just wondering if you can kind of get into a little bit of the nitty gritty of the other positions,
Sure.
like, how it stacks up there.
So Tommy oversees both departments, amateur and international. Tommy during the draft he's going to focus on those top couple of rounds. He'll see some beyond that, but his focus really is, though, for obvious reasons, are the top rounds. And then myself as the scouting director, he and I have the whole country. So again, I'm trying to see as many of what we think are the top 100, top 120 players in the country. And I'll see, because I'm going to see, like I said, the Power Fives, SEC, I'll see guys that we're going to take 8th round, 10th round, so on. Then we have 16 area scouts, and those scouts will have particular states. So for example, the scout in the Southeast has South Carolina and Georgia. The scout above him has Virginia, North Carolina, and then the scout above him has Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and so on. And then we'll have multiple scouts, for obvious reasons, in the states that have more of a volume of higher picks or more draft picks, like Florida, Texas, Georgia, California, where you have multiple scouts. Georgia, we only have the one, but he has South Carolina as well. But Florida, Texas, California, multiple scouts in those areas. Then there are regional cross-checkers who then are assigned a particular number of scouts within a particular region of the country. So we have a Southeast and a Northeast cross-checker, a Midwest cross-checker, and then a West Coast cross-checker. Those guys will generally try to see as many players within that region as they can. Maybe at least the top 10 rounds. If they can get deeper, that's great. And then we have a national pitching cross-checker where his focus, obviously the title, is on pitching. So he will try to get as deep as he can with as many pitchers as he can. He does a lot of bouncing around. Chris Hervey's our national pitching guy. So he does a lot of bouncing around. He's trying to target certain guys, see those 5th to 10th rounders, maybe a gut feel guy, projection arm late on day 3. And then we have a national cross-checker and an assistant scouting director, Drew Toussaint, who had been our national hitting cross-checker, but he was promoted in the offseason. But he'll essentially, again, focus on hitters, but he'll see most of the pitchers as well. So there is a chain there, but then what we like to do, and I think it keeps the staff engaged, we will crisscross regions. We'll send the East Coast cross-checker to the West and vice versa. We'll even send some area scouts to other areas of the country. I think it's really good so you don't get stale just seeing your area. You get to see other players, that not always the top players, maybe a guy in the 5th round, and you can compare him to your player in your area. So I think at the end of the day, though, the titles get thrown out for me. We just want to take the best players. We just want to line up the board. Obviously, at the end of the day, Tommy and I need to make the decision and bring it to Billy and Sandy. But I don't get too caught up in titles. I just consider us all New York Mets scouts. It just so happens you cover this territory and area. But my job is to take big leaguers for the New York Mets, and that's all we care about.
Awesome. And I kind of going off that, obviously you talk about have scouts in all areas of the country. We know like the Southeast, the Southwest are usually kind of hotbeds for, baseball prospects, so to speak. Can you give us some love for the Northeast? Is there, some good ball, being played here? I know it's not warm weather 12 months a year, but we got to have some good ball players here. Can you give us anything good for Northeast baseball? Bump us up a little bit.
Obviously I'm from there. Grew up and live in Western New York. So yeah, last year was a really, really good year. If you go back, look at the draft, the Northeast was excellent. Nice. It's a little down this year, and it's usually average. It just depends. But yeah, there's good players up there. It's a shame sometimes because the weather's so bad. I always feel like I'm neglecting that area because you really don't get in there until May. Right. John Koziak is our area scout in the Northeast, and he's a 30-plus year veteran, so he's got a really good feel for that area, a lot of connections. And we would love, I mean, if there's players up there, obviously we took, Anthony Kay was one that comes to mind. Justin Dunn comes to mind. But yeah, we're certainly, we'll see the top players. Sometimes because of the weather, It is difficult. You try to see some of those teams. When I was playing at St. Bonaventure, you were seeing the scouts got to see you in Florida and then may not see you for 4 months because they want a snowbird. And then when they go back up, the weather's so bad.
Right.
So I feel for that for John and for some of the players up there. But we still scout. We got a couple part-time guys in that area that know a lot of people. So we're not going to miss anybody. Jalen Palmer's one that we took on day 3. John did a great job. And Marlon McPhail, who was the cross-checker, did a great job with Jalen on that one. So we've taken players from there, but sometimes it can be a challenge to scout them in depth.
Awesome. And Mike, I'm going to get to you in a second. I just wanted to kind of hear on all this. I think folks get a little, I don't know the word, put off whatever they think, the draft is so long and, how do you really know once you get to kind of the later, points after hearing this? I hope everybody knows this is really thorough. There's a lot of people who look into this. So when you say that, you don't know what you're talking about. There's a lot that goes into this. It's really interesting as far as how advanced and how much prep work you're putting in, just going to look at players and get that kind of, that draft board together. It's really interesting.
There's so much more. I started, my first draft was 1997. There's just so much more information now. And you've learned, and scouts have learned how to use that information. I always say the most dangerous scout is the one that can evaluate and also understand the analytics.
Right.
Now you've got a guy has dual skill in that he can identify players on his own sometimes before the analysts get on it, before you get a larger sample size. So I think it's very important that we learn and evolve. I don't scout the same way I did 10 years ago.
Right.
I think I'm better than I was 10 years ago. I think I'm better than I was 5 years ago. I think you have to evolve in that aspect. And we have a lot of teaching sessions in the wintertime with all of our scouts. We want to learn this stuff. And also the flip side, some of our analysts call me up and say, hey, is it okay if I go to a game with this area scout? And they do. So there's that mutual teamwork there. That's really good with how I'm really excited for the future here with how both departments work so well together.
Collaboration. I love it. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. And this kind of ties into when we had Brian Hayes on the show, and he just talked about how the entire organization was working on that level of communication and how seeing changes, just in a short period of how things have kind of changed from the minor leagues to the scouting to the analytics department to all of that. It kind of seems like this year is finally a year where everything's kind of coming together.
Yeah, I get so much information from player development. I'm just learning those guys too, because they came over just a year or two ago. Then you had the COVID year and all that, but we've changed over that staff, and now hopefully this staff can stay for the next 5 or 10 years, and I get to know them more and they get to know us. I think that's really important that we understand how difficult their job is and they understand how difficult our job is, and we can work together. Again, the main goal is to draft, sign, develop big league, and then win a World Series. And if everybody's doing that together, again, I've worked previous places. There's been times where those two departments didn't work very well together, and that was really it wasn't something that worked well within an organization. I think here, and that goes back to Sandy, that goes back to Billy, and their leadership has been so good, and Billy's only been here a short time, but you can see how that's going to be a couple of years from now, or 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to have a plan in place and stick to that. But again, it's something that's how successful organizations sustain success.
And kind of going along with that player development, after you guys draft a guy and get him signed, how often do you keep track of players, keep players on your monitor, like all the way up through? And what's that sense of pride like once you see a guy like a Pat Mazeika or anyone of that accord that gets to the big leagues?
Well, one example just this week, Colin Holderman. Obviously, we took him in the 9th round. It's been a long road for him. I can't. You got to think player development. You have to give him a shout out. They stuck with him and got him through the injuries. It's now a big time slider. He's throwing harder than he used to throw. That's a player development win right there, and a scouting win. And those are the ones we want. There's a kid, Brendan Hardy, who just got promoted to Brooklyn. This was a young man that Jet Butler that I really don't think that any other team knew about. I think we took him in the 30s that year, and we were pumped to take him just because there really are no secrets anymore. But Jet was trying to hide this guy. We got him. He's up to 96 now. I think when we drafted him, he was 88 to 90. Again, that has the potential to be a player development win and a scouting win. And those are the ones that make me most proud, is when, everybody kind of touches the player along the way. Player development, different pitching coaches, different mental skills, different performance coaches. Our area scout was a big owner of that player. We took the player. So there's nothing better than, to call an area scout and tell them, hey, you guys getting called up to the big leagues. And you shout out, you give credit to the people that have helped them along the way. And that's those player development guys.
And that was going to be my next question, is how that feels a little bit different for a guy, well, for you and all the draft guys. For someone, Colin Holderman went through a lot, obviously a 9th rounder. Mets have had other late round guys, and they've had 1st and 2nd round guys that have made it to the big leagues. How is that kind of different for you guys as a scouting department when those guys are successful?
You mean in terms of the high picks?
Yeah. Just like you talked about, Holderman went through a lot, and he was a 9th round pick. Do you get any different type of sense of pride from these later round pick making it to the big leagues?
I think anytime anybody gets to the big league, it's very hard to get there. We've been very fortunate, knock on wood, with our first rounders and our second rounders. Either they're in the big leagues or they're prospects, or they were used in big trades. And you mentioned we have some of the guys now that are getting up there that were later round picks, McGill being one of them. That was an 8th rounder. That was a tremendous group pick. I had seen him that year. Brian Reed was the area scout. Drew Toussaint was the regional cross-checker. That was just a really good job in our process and going through him. And one of our analysts at the time, Chris Payne, really liked him as well. And again, I'm saying that's the 8th round. Scouts liked him. Analytics liked him. We did a great job with the makeup, the background, and he got to the big leagues. And again, player development kind of finished him off. He was more of a reliever that year at Arizona. We thought he could start, so they started him. Sometimes after the draft, we'll have a meeting with player development, and we go over all the players that we take. And Tyler was one of the guys that said, I really do think this guy can start. So when he goes out, that's the role that we think he should be put in. They did that, and then again, they got him better and better and better, and finished him off, and he's been pretty good for us.
Yeah, thanks for making that suggestion. That really helped, especially this year. So good job there. I was kind of curious too, just as far as, the sport overall. You've seen a lot of guys now, pitching wise at least, coming up, maybe necessarily that aren't ready because they throw hard, that sort of thing. Talking about player development, which is, kind of where you're, obviously you're taking the most pride in and putting the most work in. Is that something that not worries you, but bothers you a bit, maybe that guys get, especially pitching wise, are getting rushed up before they're ready now just because they're throwing hard? Do you want more emphasis on pitchability and being able to spot your pitches as opposed to being able to throw it through a brick wall? I'm just kind of curious, your thoughts on that.
I think it's a combination of all of what you said. There's a lot more velocity in the game. You see that at the major league level nowadays than 20 years ago. It's at the amateur level too. The average fastball when I started on the scale was 89 to 91. Now it's more 92, 94 of what you think is an average fastball. When I started, a guy touched 90, you were calling your scouting director. Now that's just kind of an ordinary arm.
Right.
They're training more specific to velocity. You may have some older scouts than I am say for some of the high school kids that it's too much too soon, where you see them throwing 97, 98, 99. But one of our analysts that I love, Joe Lefkowitz, he always jokes that velocity is king, and it is what it is. Velocity is king in the big leagues. And, I'm not going to shy away from that in the draft.
Right.
We'd like to get velocity. We'd love to get pitchability as well. But that's where player development. So we'll take, depending on, we've taken guys who have lesser command and bigger arms, and you've
Right.
taken guys with better command and maybe lesser fastballs, and you hope development can get that other part to increase or in terms of the walk decrease. So there's a happy medium there. I think you're obviously, especially with those high picks, you're trying to get both, but those guys go off the board pretty quick.
Right.
And then you're trying to identify from a scouting aspect from an analyst aspect, which one of those guys that is worth that draft pick.
Interesting. And one more kind of question, just because I'm racking my brain here. Obviously, this is more towards kind of the high school prospect that you're looking at. How much do you look at the way things are now? It seems like in the amateur level, kids really specify to one sport at a very young age. Is that something you look at as scouts, like as a pro or a con? Do you like seeing kids, especially high school kids, maybe not playing 3 sports, but playing a secondary sport to at least make them a more rounded athlete? And especially for pitchers, I would imagine that you don't like them, playing one sport and, pitching 12 months a year. So I was kind of curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think one of those first questions. So I do a lot of Zoom calls with our area scouts with some of the top prospects in the country during the wintertime. And one of the first questions I always ask is, do you play another sport, or have you played another sport? A lot of times the answer is yes,
right.
But as they get closer to their draft year, they understand that they probably don't want to take the risk of playing football or playing basketball. Bret Beatty being one, he played football.
Mm-hmm.
He stopped, I think, after his freshman or sophomore year, but he continued to play basketball. And, we're watching basketball highlights of him, and the athleticism really jumped out. So it gave us just another reason to like him because of that. So yes, I wouldn't take a point off of a kid's number because he didn't, but I think it's a positive that they do. I think it's just maybe there are different movements in different sports, and that just shows their athleticism that they can do other things. It is weird though. Certain parts of the country, high school kids tend to only play one sport. And then some others, they play 3 sports.
Right.
But yeah, that's definitely a question. I always like to know if they are. I think it's a plus. It's never a minus, but it's not a detriment if you don't in terms of how we view you.
Interesting. Mike, go ahead. I think you had something.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious to give you a chance to shout out a couple of players maybe that you're especially keeping an eye on in the Mets.
What is Ziegler's line right now, Michael?
Ziegler's line, he struck out 9 4 2/3.
Okay.
He gave up 2 runs, but they were later in the outing.
Okay. I'll take that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, obviously he's pitched well. We talked about a couple others. So is there any guys you'd want to talk about a little bit that you've drafted last year or could have been in the last couple of years that you're excited about that you've been keeping tabs on?
Well, certainly last year we were excited to get a lot of those pitchers. Ziegler being one of them. I saw him really, really late. Again, that was very much a group pick. A lot of guys saw him, and so we were very happy with that pick. I think you mentioned Carson Seymour. He's done a great job. He's pounding his sinker, high ground ball rate. I think the strikeouts will come once maybe they're just making early contact. I haven't dove into the numbers, but again, a lot of ground balls, obviously low ERA. Vassell, even the 2 lefties and the day 3s, Zwack and Lavender, have pitched really good. Rowdy Jordan's having a solid season. Christian Scott just got on the mound. I watched his start from the other day. He was 94, 96. Slider looked good, so he's just got to pitch a little bit more. But we were happy with some of those guys. I mean, I know how this goes. So they got to do it this year. They got to do it next year. They got to do it the next year. They got to do it the next year. And then when they get to the big leagues, they got to do it in the big leagues. But I like that they're going out and it's good to have initial success. At least we feel good that they were as advertised when we send guys out. So I'm really pleased with really almost all of them, how they're doing.
Awesome. And I have a question about one prospect. We talk about Alvarez ad nauseum on the show because obviously he's great and we want him to be the next Mike Piazza and we really hope that. But we've talked about, you mentioned Bret Beatty a little bit. I feel like I've heard his name a lot, but don't really know kind of the comp or the skill set. I was wondering if you could kind of tell us, not a scouting report necessarily, but what kind of, player that you think Beatty could, eventually turn into as a big leaguer and what fans could maybe kind of expect.
Well, without putting too much pressure on him, we thought he was going to be a guy that would hit, have power, and have plate discipline to where he was walking at an above average clip. I think the power right now, he's hitting the ball in the air more than he did last year. He hits the ball really hard. I've never seen, we bring in those first round picks to Citi Field after they're drafted and we bring them up to sign them. And he was hitting balls to left center where Alonso hits them, when he's pulling them. Mm-hmm. And Brett's got so much power. I think he's just learning now to how he wants to unlock it. He's just a good hitter. He's always he was that way in high school. It's like hitter first. And a lot of those guys, power sometimes how they learn to get it, how they learn to take chances, how they learn to pull the ball more and more. Then the HRs, those come in bunches where, Vientos is a different guy. He hits them from pole to pole. Brett is more kind of hitter first. I think the power is going to come. I would be shocked if it doesn't. And I'll say this for him. He was a good athlete in high school. It's not that the body was bad at all. He's done a tremendous job. His body looks absolutely terrific. I've had more scouts tell me that they think, the transformation, and I don't say that in a negative way. I just say that he took it from good to really, really good. And he's a good athlete at third base. I thought, I definitely I get to see a little snippets here on plays that he makes. I think he's going to be a good third baseman.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I mean, that's one thing I've kind of noticed from Beatty. First coming when he was drafted, there was questions about his defense, and then he kind of came right in last year and was like, why were there questions about his defense? Like, yeah. he looked great at third, and even when they played him in the outfield, he showed his athleticism that he could certainly stick in the outfield if that's where they decided to go with him.
Yeah,
too.
there's guys like that. They play a position in the minor leagues, but then they become such good hitters. If you have versatility, that was another thing with Brett. So let's just say he couldn't play. Let's say we not couldn't play. Let's say we had a third baseman there that we had signed to a long-term deal. Okay, can he go to left? Oh, this is what you want to think about as a scout. Can he go to left? Can he go to right? Can he play first? The answer to all those questions were yes. And we thought he could play third base when we drafted him. But that versatility adds another skill set to an already really good player that you think is going to be an offensive-oriented player. And have you get into the sometimes where you feel really comfortable about the power and not the bat. You feel good about the bat, not the power. We really felt like there was an equal opportunity there to have both along with on-base skills.
Absolutely. And there's just so much that goes into this. It's so interesting. We could talk to you for hours. I don't want to keep you forever. Mike said if we were, could keep you under 40 minutes, you'd tell us all your picks for the draft, but we're 43 minutes in, so I guess we can't do that.
No. You'll never have me on again then.
No, we really appreciate it. This was awesome. Just from everyone we talked to, including yourself, the Mets are seeming really good hands for the future. I'm really excited for the next few years and seeing the talent that's going to come up, and that's a testament to you guys. We really, wish you all the success in the world with the draft, and hopefully we'll have you on, maybe after the draft, we could talk to you about some of the guys you bring in and go from there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'd want you, it's nice to have me on. I like talking about this stuff and giving the shout outs and the credit to all of our guys. It's a really, really good group. I think we have a really good process. I think we have really good leadership. We obviously have a tremendous owner that's going to give you all the resources, and we plan to use those to the best of our ability. But I really feel confident that we'll nail this draft this year because of the work that the area scouts put in, the regional guys, the national guys, the analysts, our strength and conditioning people, and then the confidence that we have in the player development people as well. So I really looking very, very much excited and looking forward to this draft.
Love it. Love it. Thank you again so much for this. We're looking forward to the draft. We'll all be rooting for you.
Thank you.
Again, hopefully we'll talk to you as after the draft is over and the season goes on. But until then, tune in next week, guys. We'll be recapping the Cardinals series and previewing after that and maybe have another guest on. So don't forget to get Metsmerized until then. Thanks for watching.